Hello and welcome. I'm Diane Okonski, your host for today's program. Before we get started, I want to thank the INLUS members and donors for their contributions that make our webinars, classes, scholarships, and grants possible. Without you, we wouldn't be here. If you are not yet a member of the INLUS, please consider joining us. Information about the organization and membership may be found at inlus.org. Today, we encourage you to submit your questions using Zoom's Q&A feature, and we will answer as many as possible at the end of the program. Today's program is being recorded and will be available on the INLUS website and our YouTube channel. Today, I am pleased to have with us Zachary Jordan Melton. Zachary was born in Indiana and received his BA from Indiana Wesleyan University. After working as a 911 dispatcher and touring with a band, he moved to Iceland in 2015. He graduated from the Viking and Medieval Norse Studies master's program at the University of Iceland in 2017 and received his PhD in comparative literature in 2023. He now works as a postdoctoral researcher at the Árni Magnússon Institute in Reykjavik. So Zachary, welcome. The program Vikings in North America and North Americans in Iceland is a very intriguing title. And I'm interested in hearing more about your research journey. So I'm just going to turn the mic over to you and you can take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Diane and Douglas, and for having me. And I'm just going to share more informally, maybe than a normal talk about the research that I've been doing. I will talk about the research I did for my PhD and the research I'm doing now in my postdoctoral position. And I want to highlight some of the themes that link these two different projects. The Vikings in North America and North Americans in Iceland, excuse me. Um, but in order to explain sort of how I got here, I kind of need to start at the beginning to demonstrate, sort of my research path, which led me down this road. And as Diane mentioned, I moved to Iceland in 2015 to join the Viking and Medieval Norse Studies program, the master's program at the University of Iceland. And while I was there, I was hired by Emily Lethbridge to work with her on the Icelandic saga map. And hopefully, everyone is familiar with this resource, but if you're not, it is a really wonderful tool where we take the Icelandic sagas and we geotag the different locations where characters go and the places that are mentioned in Iceland and beyond. Um, and in the summer of 2016, I started working on geotagging some 19th century travel books. Here we have an example from William Morris, but also I worked with W.G. Collingwood and Frederick Metcalfe, who came in the late 19th century, and I tagged the different places that they went. Especially Morris and Collingwood were interested in the sites of the saga, so they were visiting a lot of places related to Njál saga and Eo's saga. And while I was working on this, I started wondering more about um, other people, especially Americans, as from my home country, that talked about the sagas and Old Norse literature or the Vikings from around this time period. And so I wrote my master's thesis about the 19th century political discourse, where different people used Old Norse literature or the Vikings to sort of bolster their arguments. Ralph Waldo Emerson makes some comments in some anti-slavery speeches about Iceland and about the Vikings, and then there were a lot of references to Old Norse mythology in different writing for in favor of the suffrage movement, and that was sort of my master's thesis. And when I decided to go on to my PhD, I thought there were a lot of a lot of rocks left unturned, a lot of things that I wanted to explore a little bit more. But the summer before I began my PhD, something happened in the United States that sort of changed my trajectory. If you remember, in August of 2017, we had a gathering in Charlottesville, Virginia, which was arguably the largest gathering of white nationalists, white separatists in decades in the United States. And what was seen there, among other volatile things, were Old Norse runes. And here you can see this picture of the Icelandic Æshelmar. Um, and other medieval symbols were spotted at this event. Um, and this created a real concern within the field of medieval studies. A lot of people, a lot of scholars, Andrew B.R. Elliott, Dorothy Kim, they started publishing papers and blog posts and giving talks about defending the field of medieval studies from these extremists. And this was much needed work, but the question that I started asking myself was, what were the roots of this relationship? How did this begin, and how can we look, in order to maybe defend or to challenge the misinterpretation or um, adaptations into questionable ideologies? Maybe it would help to look at the beginning of this, specifically in the United States. And so this is what I did with my PhD. I wanted to sort of answer the question, where did this relationship start? Um, and while this isn't the only answer, it provides maybe one perspective into this question. Um, and I thought most of these people were probably not doing their homework, reading the Eddas or the sagas, and maybe just looking at what I called the Viking discourse, different ideas about Vikings and Old Norse literature that existed in part through popular culture. So that's where I looked. I wanted to look in popular culture specifically and how this relationship may have evolved or existed in fiction and in film through from the 19th to the 20th century. And so my dissertation was called An Excuse for Violence. And I looked specifically at Viking adventures. Um, and I'll explain sort of the case studies here in a moment, but I looked at two novels from the 20th century that were then the basis for films in the 20th century. And these were adventure stories, adventure movies. And I noticed as I looked more into the uh, genre of American adventure, certain themes and tropes and archetypes that existed. And so I traced this adventure genre back to the frontier adventure, which was based on the Indian captivity narrative of the early colonial period in America. And if you're not familiar with the Indian captivity narrative, it was actually the first truly American genre that separated itself from European writing, and it had to do with colonial settlers who were kidnapped by indigenous people in North America, and then were either rescued or managed to escape or managed to get themselves released. And these early captivity narratives, they sort of gave way to some of the early American frontier heroes that we're familiar with, such as Natty Bumppo, who is the main character in James Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales, and Daniel Boone, who was an actual historical figure, but existed in sort of literary limbo in different iterations throughout the 19th and 20th century. And this led to later versions of this hero. As the frontier moved westward, the frontier hero sort of changed into later figures like Davy Crockett, who was, as I'll talk about later, a little more violent, um, a little less Victorian, we shall say, than Natty Bumppo. And so this was sort of the framework I was looking at. And I saw echoes of this early adventure narrative in these later Viking fiction, in these books, novels, and in the films. And so I looked specifically at this archetype that was based on Daniel Boone and Natty Bumppo. And here I just have a list of some certain characteristics that I saw uh, involved with these characters in their both in Boone's biography and his later fictional stories, and in the Leatherstocking Tales with Natty Bumppo. Um, and these archetypes, and then later heroes, whether it's frontier heroes, cowboy heroes, or other adventures, they seem to carry these themes with them. So we have sort of an empire builder. So Daniel Boone was famous for going into the American frontier and sort of clearing it for settlers to come. He's pushing the frontier westward and preparing for civilization to come into the wilderness. Whereas Natty Bumppo, he's sort of escaping from civilized society and fleeing into the woods. He doesn't like the rules and he likes the nature. And this goes on to inform later heroes in other adventures. One of the most important characteristics is that these heroes are basically from two different worlds. Natty Bumppo was born to white parents but raised by Native Americans. And this hybridity allows him to flit back and forth between the wilderness and civilization, where in ways that other people, other settlers could not. And Daniel Boone was kidnapped and at some point adopted, I think, by the Shawnee in one of his stories. And so this gave him this hybridity, and we see this. We can trace this back to Eliza. I think her name is Eliza Winkfield, one of the early captivity narratives, and she was the daughter of a Native American leader and a white woman, and so she had this hybridity to go to civilized society and to flit through the wilderness. They're usually skilled hunters, solitary frontiersmen who often rescue white settlers. Natty Bumppo is always, leading colonists through the wilderness to safety. They often have to fight indigenous people. They also become like Native Americans. So Natty Bumppo dresses and behaves. He has a respect for nature. And Daniel Boone, he wears the attire, and even Davy Crockett, wearing more indigenous looking attire. And they have this ability to be sort of both and neither at the same time. Um, there's a love of freedom, and there's a certain ideal manliness that goes along with them. And like I mentioned before, with both these characters in the 19th century, there's this Victorian manliness, which um, one of the most important aspects of that manliness was self-control. So if you've read the Leatherstocking Tales, Natty Bumppo does not like to commit acts of violence. He does not want to hurt anybody or to kill anybody, and he's sort of sad when he has to do this. Um, this changes over time as manliness shifts into later 20th century masculinity, but we'll try not to go into that. And this hybridity also causes them to never quite belong in one place. Through these archetypes and these tropes, certain American ideals from this time period seem to leak through. So even if it's a later 20th century adventure, by using these archetypes, certain ideas will peek through the text or through the film. Ideas such as manifest destiny, westward expansion. There's a love of freedom. The 19th century American writers love to talk about how the Vikings have a love for freedom, and this is why they're going overseas. And the Americans inherited this love for freedom. There's usually a justification for their violence, which I'll get into in a moment. There's also certain ideas of human evolutionary progress and white superiority. So in the 19th century, there's this idea that um, there are levels of civilization, that you start as a barbarian or start as a savage and move to a barbarian stage, and then eventually become civilized. And you can see this in these pieces of literature, and this appears in these Viking novels as well. There's a certain hierarchy um, that lends itself to whites being on the top and other people being below, and not even that, but as we'll see, like the English maybe are civilized because they're Christianized, and the sometimes the Vikings occupy this barbarian stage but are on their way to civilization. Again, there's an ideal manliness and masculinity, and there's these ideas of empire, especially domination over others. And I think this is the key point that I found, and we'll get to this also in a moment. So the first case study that I looked at was a novel from 1902 titled "The Thrall of Leif the Lucky" by a Swedish American author, Ottilie Liljekrantz. Um, and this was the basis for the 1928 film The Viking. This was one of the very last silent films made in the United States. Um, and it was also one of the first made in Technicolor. It's a very strange sort of intersection of technology, this film. And the key figure, the hero of the story, is Alwyn. He's an English lord who is taken captive by the Vikings. So we already have an echo of a captivity narrative. The Vikings are clearly sort of on this barbaric level because Alwyn is a Christian. He's English, so he's on this higher tier of the hierarchy. But over time, partially because he falls in love with a Viking woman, he becomes like this lower, inferior people. He finds himself becoming like a Viking, like the Norse that surround him. And this sort of bothers him. But again, we see these echoes of Natty Bumppo being like a Native American. And Alwyn, most importantly, is able to demonstrate his civilization through his ability to have self-control. Several times in the novel, and you can see this in the film as well, he's ready to strike someone with a sword, and he stops at the last moment, and is able to contain himself. And Leif Erikson in the film, he sometimes is able to do this. We see him stop a few times, but other times his rage gets the better of him, and that is to let us know he's not quite made it. Even though he's a Christian, he's converted. He's not quite made it to that civilized nation, civilized tier. Leif Erikson and Alwyn in the novel, they sail west to Vinland. Um, Vikings in these 20th century works of fiction and film, they're almost always moving westward. Whether this is an echo of Manifest Destiny, you can interpret that, but I think it certainly has something to do with this expansion, this empire building, and they bring civilization to America via uh, Christianity. And I don't know if anybody has seen the film, but the ending is completely bonkers. But we have Leif Erikson putting a cross around the neck of a Native American as the camera pans to the Newport Tower in Newport, Rhode Island. Of course, the um, fake Viking relic that was used by many 19th century intellectuals. And as it pans over, a place card comes on the screen. It says, "This tower was built like the fathers before them," and it suggests that the Vikings stayed in North America. And as they show the tower, the Star Spangled Banner starts playing in the background. It's very a wild ending. But the idea here is that they bring civilization. They it's important to note that the Native Americans don't give a gift in return. It is a one-sided gift. They are being brought Christianity and civilization, and so we you can see some of the echoes of these archetypes and this adventure story manifest themselves in the novel and in the film. And through that, these sort of 19th century ideas continue to latch themselves on to these tropes and to these archetypes. The second case study that I looked at was the 1951 novel The Viking by Edison Marshall, and this was the basis for the 1958 epic film The Vikings, starring Kirk Douglas and Tony Curtis, who you see here on the screen. And again, it follows a similar pattern. The main character, he's called Ogier in the novel, but Eric in the film. He is taken captive as a child, made a slave. Alwyn, I should mention in the 1928 film, he was also sold into slavery. This is a key point later on, but there's always the loss of freedom, which is a very strong American ideal. This loss of freedom justifies any violence these men might commit. And so this is sort of where I got the title of my PhD dissertation, The Excuse for Violence, because I think yeah, over time the Vikings, you want to see them kill more people, as we see in later films. But as we learn as the novel goes along, the main character, Ogier, his mother is the English queen from Northumbria in Need, and his father is Ragnar Lothbrok. So from two worlds, this hybridity. He is in the film, he's an or I'm sorry, in the novel, he is an expert hunter. He often goes into the woods alone and hunts, and he's able to he likes to be by himself. He becomes like the Vikings, and he's yelling for Odin, even though he's a slave. And at the end of the novel, uh, he decides he can't be either in Scandinavia or in England. He feels like he doesn't belong in either place. So he and his lover, they sail westward to this mythological land called Avalon, and we learn at the very end that in Avalon he meets a man with red skin, and we can deduce that they went to North America. Again, this westward expansion, again not quite belonging in either place, and having to go. In this case, he is not the empire builder that maybe Alwyn and Leif were, but he's fleeing modern society. So he's this second iteration of this archetype. And I saw these echoes in almost every novel and film that I watched, some more than others. Um, there's another a novel that I cannot recommend. I would never ask anybody to read this, but I thought it was interesting because Bill Downey is an African American journalist, and he wrote this book in 1981 called Black Viking. Um, and again, his the main character who you see here on the cover of the book, who I learned was modeled after the blues artist Taj Mahal. Um, in the novel, his mother is Moorish and his father is a Viking. So again, from two worlds, this hybridity. He never quite belongs in one place. And I found this great review of the book in which the critic says he was complaining about the stilted way Downey had the Vikings speak in the book. And he says, "Do Vikings talk like stage Indians? Actually, we are more likely to choke in the dust of their bombast. But don't blame Downey. That's what Valhalla mongering is all about. Vikings are less Indians than cowboys of the icy fjords, and they hold the same adolescent appeal." So this critic highlights what I had been thinking all along, is that Vikings were sort of interchangeable now with cowboys or with the frontier hero, because they carry the same weight. They, when used in the same way, they're hybrid, they're violent, they're able for self-control. These men never hurt kids or women, just like Natty Bumppo didn't, but they're present at these acts of violence. So they never quite partake in themselves, but they are there and they are allowing it to happen. And so, over time, the westward hero, the cowboy, becomes more violent, and so too with the Vikings, we see an increase in sexual violence, particularly. But when the Vikings become Americanized in this way, based on the American adventure hero, um, we see these echoes, these archetypes come through. So Viking heroes, they never come from two worlds. Almost always. Even recently, The Northman came out. I don't know if anybody saw this film, co-written by the Icelandic author Sjón. But we learn at the end of the film that the Viking hero, his mother was a slave. Not quite. We don't know for sure if she was Scandinavian, but it seems like she wasn't. She was maybe Eastern European. So again, almost always the hero comes from two different worlds. And in the Northmen, he becomes sort of like the Eastern Europeans, and he sets them free, and he's interacting with them. Um, he voluntarily becomes a slave, which we saw in the 1928 film and the 1951 film. So these things are very prevalent even today in these works of Viking fiction. Um, and again, in nearly every work of fiction, the character is taken captive. Uh, Again, sort of a captivity narrative echo from early colonial period. Vikings are almost always moving westward, echoing Manifest Destiny, whether they're going to England or to Vinland. At least with the Northmen, they go east to an Eastern European country. So we have sort of a disruption of this motif, but in general, the Vikings are always moving westward. But most importantly, the Vikings confront other cultures and they dominate them. And in fact, they dominate almost any group of people they come in contact with. And whether that's women, whether that's Christians, whether that's the English, whether that's the Native Americans in Vinland, the Vikings are almost always dominating people. And when the Vikings are presented on screen, like in the Northmen or like in these other works, they are strong, white men, and they're always dominating somewhere else. And so these are the themes that I picked out on. And this doesn't really answer the question totally. There's a lot of different, uh, things such as the, Old Norse pagan religion that also has some problematic issues. But I thought that this was maybe one way in which people saw these underlying issues seep through American literary history and film history, and they see these ideas of a white Viking dominating other people, and that could lend itself to the problems that we saw at Charlottesville. Now, I'm going to completely switch gears, but I will highlight some of the themes that I found that sort of link these my PhD to my postdoc. Um, but the postdoctoral position I have is in the group called it's the project called Kvennaspor, which means women's footsteps in Icelandic. It's unveiling and foregrounding women in Icelandic saga landscapes. And our goal here is to produce new knowledge about women and their place in Icelandic landscape. There are two major focuses in this research project. One is on women in Icelandic landscapes within the Icelandic narrative sources, Icelandic sagas in particular. And my part of the project has been more on the 19th and 20th century women and their unstudied accounts of travel to Iceland and their engagement with the saga sites. So similar to the work I did on the saga map, but now I was focusing solely on women who came to Iceland. We chose to look between 1845, which is when Ida Pfeiffer, an Austrian travel writer, came to Iceland, and 1945, sort of the end of World War II, because after World War II, it becomes a little bit easier to access and travel to Iceland. You could fly there, whereas before you had to take a steamship. And our website is now live. If you want to go look at the work that I've been doing, it's at kvennaspor.is. And I've created this database of all the women that I could find um, who traveled to Iceland and left some sort of uh, a hint of their being there. So whether they wrote a travel book or a travel article, I've looked through letters and diaries and unpublished articles, newspaper clippings. One of the more fascinating things that I discovered were social club meetings. So a lot of women would come to Iceland for a very short trip, let's say on a cruise. They'd stop in Reykjavik for a few days. They would return to North America or sometimes in Germany or England, and they would give a report on a women's social club about Iceland. And so this is another uh, a really wonderful resource. Even though a lot of the transcripts don't exist anymore, we know that they were talking about travel to Iceland in these groups, and so this is sort of what it looks like here. We have the name of the woman that went, the year she was in Iceland, and we have links to the writing if we could find it. Um, of course, some of them they don't, they're just in a newspaper clipping somewhere or in an archive somewhere that we don't have access to. Um, Generally, there I've found not everyone fits into these categories, but there's more or less three types of travelers that I've discovered. In the 19th century, they're predominantly professionals, botanists, professional travel writers, naturalists, authors. They come to Iceland in order to do their work, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in depth. In the 20th century, particularly after World War One, this is when we get the steamships, the cruises coming to Iceland, and we have a lot more tourists that stop through rather than professionals. And then the most people that come is in 1930, and this was the 1000th anniversary of the establishment of the Alþingi, the Icelandic Parliament. And here we have lots and lots of Western Icelanders um, from Minnesota, from Manitoba, and I'll highlight some of these in a moment. One of the earliest professionals groups that I could find was in 1895. Um, Three temperance workers come to Iceland uh, as part of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and they are interested in setting up anti-alcohol, a chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in Iceland. And I found these articles in the Ladies' Home Companion from 1896, and it's three parts. And these were Jesse Ackerman, who was a missionary for the Women's uh, Christian Temperance Union, Nana Pratt, and Ruth Schaffner. And we learned early on, and this sort of ties back into my PhD research, that Nana and Ruth were both teachers at the Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which, uh, if you're from North America, you know that the Indian schools are a very dark chapter in American history and as well in Canadian history. Um, I should also mention that these women were also in Iceland at the same time as the naturalist Elizabeth Taylor. I was just in Minneapolis looking at Elizabeth Taylor's diaries from this time period and her letters, and I found some really great things. It's interesting that these American women were there at the same time, and they never seemed to cross paths. Um, but uh, sort of to go back to this hierarchy that I saw in fiction and film, here we have a real life version of someone who came to Iceland, Ruth Schaffner, who taught at the Carlisle Indian School, writing an article the same year as the Three Ladies in Iceland was published in the Ladies' Home Companion. And she wrote an article called Civilizing the American Indian. Um, it is problematic, but it's not as bad as it sounds. She really there's this benevolence that she wants to help, but again, it's this echo of what I saw in the fiction books of these tiers, right? There's civilization, and she's trying to help, sort of doing, you could call it the white man's burden, or perhaps the white woman's burden in this case, of trying to help indigenous people. But of course, we know this had a lot of intergenerational trauma attached to it. Nana Pratt, who was in Iceland, her father actually founded the school, Captain Richard Henry Pratt, who coined the phrase "kill the Indian, save the man." So generally, the early professionals that came in the 19th century were not this problematic, and there's very, Ruth and Nana didn't really talk about Iceland in relation to this sort of thing. But I did find an interesting quote in one of the Ladies Home Companion articles. And Jessie Ackerman, who writes these, she and her group are at a banquet of some sort before they leave, and a politician from the All Thingy stands up to propose a toast, which she makes sure to mention is lemonade and not alcohol, because of course they're anti-alcohol. And this politician says, when the Vikings left Iceland in the early centuries and first landed in America, they went forth to conquest with sword and returned in blood. But these Viking women from America came with a stronger weapon than sword or spear, the mightiest weapon ever wielded, love. They came in love and returned in victory, for they have conquered. Um, there's a lot to unpack there, and I won't spend a lot of time. I thought this was a really wonderful quote, and again, sort of highlights this westward expansion and this violence that was taking place with Vikings and Native Americans, and if only we had these temperance workers with their mighty weapon of love, maybe that wouldn't have happened the same way, according to this politician. So the tourists in Iceland, this usually started with the there was a few cruise lines that started sailing from New York. They would stop in Reykjavik for about 3 days, and then go on typically to Norway, Spitzenberg, and then usually Russia before returning. And this was a very common, I think, it was the North Star cruise, I think it was what it's called. And usually the women would stay in Reykjavik and not venture out too much. But if they were ambitious, a lot of times they would hire a car. They loved going to Laugardalr to see the women wash in the natural hot springs there. And they would comment a lot on the flowers in Iceland, the national costume. They were especially interested in education. And almost everybody remarked on how ugly the houses were in Reykjavik, unfortunately. One of the problems I ran into with a lot of these tourists was anonymity. Many women wrote or talked about their experiences by using their married names. So we have Mrs. Jerome Raymond or Mrs. David McLaren. This has been very difficult to find out who some of these women were, and we see here even David McLaren's wife doesn't even get a name in the archives. Um, on the right here is WSC Russell, who made 4 trips to Iceland before he wrote his book in 1914. And he just mentions in the preface that his wife came on 2 of these. And we don't have really any indications of what she did other than his narrative. And here she is in the Icelandic national costume. I don't know if she bought this and returned home or she dressed up while she was there, but um, sometimes a woman would visit Iceland and then get married. And so we lose, she's got a different name later on, and that's been difficult to find. And of course, some women were housewives without a cultural impact. So, there's not going to be an archive for all these people. And there were, on the other hand, there were some women, such as someone from my home state of Indiana, where her visit to Iceland was almost the only existing thread left of her life. She was almost mentioned. I couldn't find any other information about her except she visited Iceland in 1930 for the millennial celebration of the All Thing. Which brings me to the 1930s celebration. We have a lot of Western Icelanders who were invited or wanted to come back to the land of their parents or grandparents. And here is just one example of an article letting the Icelandic population know that of the prominent Western Icelanders who were going to join them. You can see here Dr. Edith Ross from Winnipeg. Richard Beck, of course, came. Here at the bottom, Mrs. Emily Walters, that's just Thorstina Jackson Walters, who wrote a lot in the 20th century about the Western Icelandic communities. I have been able to look at a lot of her archival material as she came to Iceland several times. Um, and then we have some people that I can't find any information about. Emma Sigurdsson, who's just she's mentioned a Kennedy, a teacher from Aalborg, Manitoba, and Violet Code, who became a famous Broadway singer. Not a lot of information about her. She was from Minneapolis. Um, and one of the most interesting things that I discovered from this period is some members of the Spanish Fork Icelandic community came and were invited. I started to become under the impression that the Spanish Fork community was sort of ostracized because of their religion, or at least lost contact with the other Western Icelanders, and especially with Iceland itself. But at least two or three women from Spanish Fork came, and one gave a concert at Gamla Bio in Reykjavik. So she was asked to sing as part of this event. So at least one of the things that this part of the research suggests is that maybe there were stronger ties than we thought with the Spanish Fork community, at least in the early 20th century. These are just some of the Western Icelanders I thought I would mention. Um, the one on the far right was Violet Code. I mentioned she was a famous Broadway star. She also sang for King Christian X at the 1930s celebrations, and was unfortunately awarded some prize by Mussolini when she went to Italy during the 1930s. Her real name was Fjóla Laurusson. Her father was an Icelandic immigrant and taught music, was a composer, and some of the pieces that he composed and wrote and arranged are still in the archives at the University of Minnesota. In the middle is an Icelandic translator. Her name is Mekken S. Perkins. She married a man, I think his name was John Perkins, and he worked for the State Department. She ended up in Washington, D.C., but she had translated quite a few Icelandic short stories into English, which generated some interest in Icelandic literature during this time period. And she's been mostly forgotten as a translator, so it was exciting to see her name on there. And then on the left is Aline Anderson. She was a Western Icelander from Selkirk, Manitoba, and she ended up at the University of Vermont, working for the Eugenics Survey Vermont. Not to bring back in the same themes of race, but at least this time we have a positive impact. Her She wrote a book in 1937. She had spent a lot of time with different groups of people, um, different races, different classes in Vermont. And she wrote a book in 1937 that actually challenged the racial and class prejudice in America at that time, and changed the field of eugenics from what we probably think of now into a different field of social science. And she was instrumental in that. And again, the whole point of this project is to highlight that these women were in Iceland and that their stories deserve to be told. And remembered. These were important figures at the time. Now I did the positive, now I'll get to the sort of negative here. One of the more fascinating and problematic characters that I found was a woman named Kitty Cheatham. She was from Nashville, Tennessee. I'm going to go next week to look in her archives at the Tennessee State Library. She was one of only two women that spoke at the 1930 millennial celebrations. And she was a trained actress and singer, and she had taken a very strange interest in the Norse discovery of America, which I'll get into in a moment. But she became famous in Europe for her renditions of, and please excuse this dated term, quote unquote Negro spiritual. She was taking African American folk songs and doing her own versions of them, and very, very problematic issues here. And she tends to tie in, the ideas of this racial hierarchy, human evolutionary progress with Iceland. She had a real issue with the Star Spangled Banner and wrote several books booklets, pamphlets, and letters to the editor of the New York Times about how much she hated the Star Spangled Banner. But for her, the Icelandic national anthem was the ideal national anthem. And she often ties in um, biblical prophecy with the Leif Erikson's discovery of North America into this very bizarre stuff. And here we see her say, she's praising the Icelandic national anthem, and she goes on to say, nationally, Iceland is America's mother by right of discovery. The young Icelander Leif Erikson, having landed on these shores in the year 1000, and by right of spiritual idealism based upon divine demand for the glorious liberty of the children of God. Um, and a lot of her writing goes back to this idea. What she is basically saying is that um, she wants to emphasize the fact that Americans have inherited ideals from Icelanders, from the Norse, and especially their prototypical Lutheranism rather than Catholicism, and whiteness rather than any other color. And I won't go too much into this, but she says the African Americans of today, um, she says the evolution from savagery to slavery, even its abuses, was a growth, and the correlative expression of this growth came forth in their music. Really problematic stuff, and she intertwines this stuff more than anybody else with Iceland and with um, the especially the discovery narrative described in the Vinland sagas. And so, even though I tried to get away from this research, it keeps popping up, and there's something about Iceland, and there's something about the discovery of America, the Vinland sagas, and there's something about Vikings that seem to bring this stuff out, especially when it comes to North Americans. And I don't know if it's the hyper sensitivity and the hyper awareness of race or what, but even when there are even when people are traveling to Iceland, these themes keep popping up. And here I found a very bizarre story from the 1930 millennial celebrations in which an African American tried to get a hotel either room or tried to eat. It's unclear exactly which, and he was turned away. But the guests at the hotel decided to vote to let this person eat or to stay at the hotel. What they don't mention is that the vote took 2 days to get everybody in the hotel. So by that point, he probably found another place to stay or another meal somewhere. But this was maybe the first time Iceland had to confront this sort of prejudice. And even, I mentioned before the Northmen. I was able to sit down with Sean, who co-wrote the film, and even an Icelander trying to make a film about the Vikings, about his ancestors. He is hyper aware and tried his very best to try to sidestep some of these problematic issues that I discussed in the first half of this talk. And this continues to be an issue where we have to be careful with this Viking discourse, this Viking aesthetic, because it has generated these problems over time. So that's all I have. Thank you very much for listening, everyone that's attended and those that might listen later on.
So thank you very much, Zachary. Very, very interesting. And you actually did tie Vikings coming to North America to the Iceland or to the North Americans going to Iceland. Very good. I've got a question, and we welcome questions from people now as we're wrapping up. Given the current status of immigration and the number of non-Icelanders living in Iceland, do you see any parallels between the concepts that you've noticed in today's world?
It's not as it's not as apparent as maybe we would see in the American context. I think in Iceland it's much more nationalistic than it is concerned with race. They really love their Icelandic heritage, their culture, and especially their language. And if you can speak Icelandic, And if you can sort of, you know, sort of get that theta retist mentality, I think they're going to be more okay with it. I do know that the biggest demographic outside of Icelanders in Iceland is Polish, and there has been some difficulty in that. But even now, there are Polish people involved in politics, in the unions, and I think even in the all thingy. So they are making drastic steps, and we've seen situations such as there right now. This is big in the Icelandic news. There's a young Palestinian boy who's disabled that is has he's been threatened with deportation, and the way the Icelandic community has really supported and wrapped their arms around him and tried to protect him from being deported has been really, really wonderful. So there are some issues in Iceland when it comes to this sort of thing, but I don't think it's anywhere near as bad as some of the stuff we've seen in the United States.
Okay, all right. Well, we have no other questions, so we'll just wrap this up. And Zachary, thank you so much. But before we turn off the cameras, I want to let you know what's on the INLUS calendar. The current set of our very popular Icelandic language classes started on Monday, and they will run to mid-November. Information on our Icelandic language classes can be found on the INLUS website. We do have one other webinar scheduled for 2024, and that will take place on November 14th, when we will have a very interesting webinar by Bethany Rogers on the history of Icelandic food. And that will include a demonstration of making skyr, which is far easier than what you may think. Beth lives in Iceland, so this will be an early seminar. It will start at noon Eastern and earlier for almost everybody else in North America. And one last thing, as we're wrapping up the year, if you know of an Icelandic celebration coming up, please drop us a line with the details, so we can post it on our community calendar. Our email address is info@inlus.org. Zachary, thank you again for your time and for your research and sharing all your findings with us. And thank you for the attendees today. I hope you enjoyed the program. Bye-bye.